You are listening to Rootbound, a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside.
Do you like coffee that's just a little too bitter? Then try chicory. It makes strong coffee stronger.
Hello everybody, thank you for listening to this episode of Rootbound. I am the host of the show, and my name is Steve, and Rootbound is the podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside. And each week I invite a guest who joins me on the show to share with us all about a plant that means something to them, and then I share with the guest about a plant that means something to me, and through this process we can all learn more about plants and learn more about each other. Now let me paint a little visual picture here for you to explain the background sounds we're hearing at the moment. I happen to be on a little vacation in Zurich, Switzerland. I'm sitting here with my kid in the stroller. I'm looking at the Limmat River right in downtown Zurich, Switzerland. There's some cars driving by. You might hear a tram in the background. Early morning clatter of people getting on their day on a Monday morning. And you might ask, what does this have to do with about plants? Well, exactly in this moment, nothing. However, earlier this morning, I set up my phone to do a little time lapse of the sunrise. And I was pointing my phone out the window of our little place we're staying at Uetliberg, which is the little mountain that is within the canton of Zurich. And when I watched the time-lapse after it was finished, I noticed off in the distance, in front of Uetliberg, where there's a lot of trees, I saw little clouds forming. And the time-lapse really accentuated the forming of these clouds in the same kind of areas right along the mountain of Uetliberg. And that reminded me of something I spoke about with our guest today, which is transpiration. And this is a very cool process. It's the process of how plants, in this episode we're talking specifically about trees, but basically all green plants do this, move water from their roots up to their leaves. And in the case of trees, in the case of really big trees, they're doing something really phenomenal and moving this water so high. In fact, there's some people who think what trees are doing is impossible. There's like a physics thing about how high a water column can be. And then it's pretty technical and a little bit hard to explain. And to be honest, I don't remember exactly how to explain it, but I'll leave a link to a Veritasium video that explains this process about how trees move water through this very high water column in kind of apparent breaking of the laws of physics, which they're not. But anyway, I'll leave a link to that in the show notes. However, the most interesting fact about transpiration that caught my attention is the fact that, the trees are moving this water up, all the way up, huge distances. They're bringing minerals from the ground up to their leaves. But 97 to 99% of that water that moves up the tree just evaporates into the sky. And in certain cases, trees themselves can form clouds, which is what I saw this morning in Uetliberg, and which is what happens with a lot of large trees. So that's what I want to share with you this morning before we meet our guest. And speaking of our guest, let's meet her right now.
Would you tell us what transpired, please?
Your Honor, it's perfectly clear what transpired in this case.
Hi, Sophia. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Rootbound.
Hello, it's great to be here.
Do you have a plant to share with us today?
I do have a plant to share with us today. Well, I guess with everyone today.
Uh-huh.
That plant would be Sequoia sempervirens, or the coastal redwood.
Wonderful. I'm surprised no one has picked this tree before, because it's like, it's the tree, right? It's yeah. I'm sure you'll go into it, but yeah, I'm really excited. I don't have a lot of let's just get into it. It's a cool tree. Why is it meaningful to you?
So it's meaningful to me because I grew up along the coast of California. I'm still sort of in the San Francisco Peninsula these days. And some of my most memorable trips with my family, field trips with my classes as a kid, were going to especially the Santa Cruz Mountains. And sometimes, if we were ambitious, going up to like the Humboldt area and seeing these crazy big trees. The redwoods just bring such a simultaneous kind of sense of calm and excitement for me that's really a little ethereal. It's a little otherworldly. And so I personally just think they're really, really cool, which I have a sense is a feeling that's shared by a lot of people.
Absolutely. Can you take me back to like when you're a kid and like sometime remembering experiencing one?
Yeah, I think I did realize in researching for this podcast that I think one of my most distinct sequoia memories was actually a giant sequoia, which I'll touch on a tiny bit because they're the really, really wide ones, that like famous tree that used to have like a highway that ran through it. But that's the wrong species. It's the other surviving sequoia species. But I do remember, I think, going up to like Armstrong redwoods with my family and seeing flood lines on the trees. They were so old they'd gone through centuries of flooding, and they had these different kind of scars on their trunks, which was really cool.
Whoa! Like how high?
Oh man, some of them were like 10 to 15 feet above the road, so water had definitely made its way pretty high on that road before.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yep.
That's really interesting. Yeah, maybe before we get into the coastal redwood, is that what you said, right? This species. I feel like all those, there's a few maybe it's only two, but I feel like they kind of blend together in my head. Like, what's a sequoia? What's a redwood? Is like, can you disambiguate those for us?
Totally. So there are two extant, which is the fancy word for surviving sequoia species. Sequoias are a super old and originally pretty diverse, I guess, group. I forget where sequoia falls in their exact taxonomy.
That would be a genus. That's a genus.
But there's two, yeah, they're a genus. So there's two species that are still with us today: Sequoia sempervirens, which is the coast redwood, and Sequoia gigantica, I believe, which is the giant redwood. And they're really easy to mix up, especially when it's like fuzzy childhood memories of thinking trees are cool. But Sequoia sempervirens, the coast redwood, they're really famous for being the tallest tree in the world. They can grow up to about the height of a 37-story building.
Wow.
So absolutely huge. And the Sequoia gigantica, the giant sequoia, is famous for being very, very wide. So they're like the tree that you can drive through. And then coast redwoods kind of almost look like a giant Christmas tree sometimes. They're very kind of triangular and neat in shape a lot of the time. As they get old, they can get a little gnarlier, but they tend to be kind of triangular. And then giant sequoias are a little like almost sparser. And I don't want to say their branches are like uglier, but they're less of that like aesthetic, nice, like triangle conifer.
Cool. I'm going to keep my eye out for that next time I happen to be in California, because that would help. I'm forgetting the name of the state park I was in a few years ago, which was the first time I had been back. I used to live in California and like have some early memories, but it was the first time like as like an adult where I was like, oh, I'm in the redwoods now. But I couldn't tell the difference, I think, between the two. They're kind of, do they intersperse a lot?
So I also should have mentioned one of the most distinctive things about them is they have different ranges. They both Sequoia species really like to be relatively temperate. They don't usually like to get super hot or super cold, but moisture is the big thing for them. So they're often on the wetter side of a mountain range. So for the coast redwoods, that's the Santa Cruz Mountains, all the way up through the Pacific, or I guess some of the Pacific Northwest into southern Oregon. And then a little farther east in the Sierras is the giant sequoias. So I don't think they technically intermingle. I'm not an arborist, so I won't say it's impossible, but I don't know of them doing.
Okay, they must have been specific because there's some, you might know this off the top of your head. There's some like it's a state park. It's not a national park that's south of San Francisco, maybe about an hour. It's called like, it's got a name that's like Big Tree Park or something very obvious, I think.
Right. It might be Big Basin,
that's the
aka
one.
Big Basin Redwoods.
That's the
it's
one.
Got a ton.
Yeah, that was really cool.
Yeah, that one I'll share some good and bad news about a little bit, because it got impacted really heavily by fire in 2020. And so a lot of old growth redwoods went away, but redwoods are also really, really good at regrowing after even intense fires. So they're kind of showing their talents as the park kind of reopens and rebuilds.
Interesting. Why don't we jump right into that? I have something in the back of my head that fire is kind of important in a number of ways for these trees, but maybe you can talk about that.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of layers I started to realize to why I chose Sequoia sempervirens, coast redwood, because there's like the top layer of it just like being really neat to look at. And then there's the underlying layers of like how crucial it is in the ecosystems where it exists and how many cool traits it has, like evolving along with fire and even being referred to as what's called a pyrophyte. So it's a species that basically incorporates recurring fires into its life cycle. So yeah, it has It's really interesting. I was reading, I don't know if this is true because it was the first time I'd seen it, but when I was researching for this podcast, I saw that new growth of redwoods is relatively uncommon from their seed pods. What I do know is their seed pods almost like these tiny little tightly closed pine cones, and they open up when they're exposed to extreme heat, like in a fire.
I read that too, and that
So they're meant to kind of
yeah, that makes sense. You think about like it's a very nuanced topic, I think, but we spend a lot of time fighting fires, but of course fires do have natural processes, and sometimes the fact that maybe they're not spreading with their seeds is because we're not necessarily letting them, but it's a balance because you also like fires are more intense and the causes are kind of not natural anymore. So anyway, it's a weird topic, but yeah, that's really fascinating.
totally, and that's part of the kind of cool fire facts and like fire resistance or fire resilience in redwoods is also that their bark is really, really thick. They have this really thick kind of almost, it's not like scaly, but like woody also doesn't seem like a great way to describe it because they're a tree. But it almost reminds you of like a coconut husk in a way. It's like that kind of texture, and it can be up to a foot thick.
Whoa.
So their bark is super thick, and it's full of tannins. So they're really good at surviving fire. And then even if they don't, like the way that we've suppressed fire, the way that humans have kind of addressed fire for the last couple hundred years is to like really, really try and manage fuels and like put out fires whenever they happen. But then sometimes fuel builds up and fires burn really intensely. So those really, really intense wildfires like we've started to get in California and the Pacific Northwest can still harm redwood trees, even with that really thick bark. But another cool thing that coast redwoods can do is that they have this thing they can do called epicormic growth, where they get these big like groups of stems under the surface of their bark. So they're protected. If there's something like a fire or a flood, they're kind of guarded by a bark layer. But if the main tree burns away, those stems under the bark get exposed and they can each turn into a new tree.
Whoa.
So they really regenerate.
That you just like totally like sparked a memory, and you probably know this place too, being where there is. There's this place called like, is it like the Trees of Mystery or the Trees of, what is that called? The Trees of, it's like a tourist attraction on the coast in California. The tree, and they have all these like trees that grew in weird ways, and they're mostly redwoods as far as I remember. And like some of them are growing in these like multiple trees growing up. There's like one that's like a chapel. It looks like people get married there because it like turned into like a like. Anyway, that makes me think of that's probably why that happened. I want to look that up. You're not aware of that place?
That one I don't know off the top of my head. I remember going to like Gilroy Gardens as a kid and seeing like willow trees trained to do really weird things, but that's all I got in terms of memories of like cool growing trees.
I'll put a link in the show notes if I can find that out. I totally remember being there as a kid and seeing like these really interesting redwoods growing in these like interesting ways. Cool. What else we have? What else we have to say about the coastal redwood?
So yeah, I'll say one last thing on that, and then I'll move on to the rest of my notes because I wrote down a lot.
Awesome.
I went a little crazy on research for this.
I love it.
So the memories you may have of trees like growing in groups, it's a super common occurrence after sort of a main tree or like an old growth tree is damaged and can't grow anymore or is cut down or burned down. This thing called a fairy ring will grow, where those burls start to all, like the stems are all exposed, they all start to sprout, and then like 6 new trees grow in a circle around the stump of the old tree.
Wow, that's so cool.
It's really cool. It makes for really cool photo ops when you like stand in the middle of a fairy ring and you like take a picture of the sky.
Very cool.
So yeah, it's pretty cool, and I just learned it was called epicormic growth when researching for this podcast. So
that's a good
fun fact.
That's a $10 word for sure.
So a little more about coast redwoods and why they grow where they do. So redwoods are super duper dependent on having enough water in their environment. I don't know if this statistic is correct, but I was anecdotally told by one of my coworkers that old growth redwoods that are over, I think it's 200 feet tall or 250 feet tall, consume up to 500 gallons of water a day.
Whoa.
Just to like circulate through their system.
Wow.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I saw this video a while back that was explaining that process of transpiration, and like I didn't realize, so I thought about it. It's like the the vast majority of the water that moves through any tree, and I think for a redwood it must be a lot because they're huge, just evaporates. Right? It's like this process of moving
Exactly.
water from the ground to the sky. Anyway, so cool.
Mm-hmm. Totally. It's a ton of what they do. And the kind of cool thing about redwoods is I don't know if it's just because of this, but in part because they have this really extensive canopy. Like while they're growing up, they're also growing out, not quite as much as giant sequoias, but they have this really big tree canopy where the water can recollect and they kind of make their own rain or their own fog in their under canopy. So they water other plants, which is cool.
Wow, so cool.
Yeah, they're great at sharing.
They're like taking on the role of the clouds because they're so tall. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And they share a lot of stuff. Actually, they both they don't have a taproot, which is really interesting given how tall they are.
Whoa.
Yeah, a lot of trees, or the way that I kind of learned about tree-like plants and trees as a kid was like the way that their branch structure looks above the ground, their root structure often looks below the ground. But redwoods do not at all follow that rule. Their roots are pretty, sometimes dangerously shallow for such like tall trees.
That's interesting. I talked about...
But what they can do...
Oh, sorry. I talked about spruce a while back, and spruce is like that. And I've seen these places where spruces fall down, and you see like the whole, like, it's like a huge circle, right? Massive. But I've also seen places where there was a lot of spruce growing together, and because they're so shallow, when like a few get knocked over, they just rip them all up and just like takes the whole mountainside down. But I can't imagine that happening with the redwoods. That's like, wow. Does that happen?
It can. Luckily, it becomes somewhat less likely because they do connect their roots together a lot, which is cool. Redwoods are surprisingly good at growing pretty close to each other and like sharing the resources that are available in the soil and in the moisture in the air. But if there is a really bad landslide or flood or fire, they can all come down, and this gigantic root ball that's really all of their roots together will rip out of the ground, and then that can be like like a square quarter of a mile if it's enough redwood trees, because they're huge. Their roots go way out, just not way down.
Interesting. Wow, that's incredible.
So,
who would have thought the biggest tree in the world or one of them has such shallow roots? So interesting.
Right? Yeah, you'd think. I mean, they have ways of, kind of connecting their roots and trying to ensure that they don't fall, but it's kind of crazy that they evolved that way and they've survived that long without having a root that goes down to get water or to like really stabilize them.
Fascinating.
And they share lots of other stuff too. So they share they're in their root structure where they grow their roots together with their neighbors. They can also transfer nutrients. So they'll make sure that a neighboring tree has enough water, what else do they need? Enough carbon and nitrogen, I think are their main things, and oxygen. But something kind of crazy that can happen because this nutrient transfer is so effective. There are these really rare but possible things called white redwoods that have no chlorophyll whatsoever in their needles.
Whoa.
So they have these weird ghostly white needles, and they only survive because their roots are connected to the other redwoods around them because they can't do photosynthesis.
Whoa. That's incredible. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. They're so helpful. They're like it's like a big family over there.
Mm-hmm. And I haven't even gotten into the fungus side of it yet, which is my personal favorite part. I'm kind of a fungus nerd also. So they have these roots connected together, and then at kind of the little like hairy filament ends of their roots, they'll connect into almost like a fungus information and nutrient superhighway kind of.
Yeah.
Where it's called mycelium. I don't know. I haven't listened to all the episodes of this podcast. I don't know if anyone's brought it up before.
I'm surprised we haven't really got into like the mycorrhizal network celium thing. So this is I think a great way to start because there's that book. Oh man, what's that book by the German guy? It's like The Hidden Life of Trees. Have you read that one? Good. Anyway, that's the first time I encountered that concept. But yeah, let's get into it because I think this is a perfect tree to talk about this.
Awesome. Great. Yeah, they are super active in mycorrhizal networks, as you mentioned. So they connect with, yeah, these little white, super thin, most of the time, almost like hair-looking fibers called mycelium that connect into this big sort of net called the mycelial network. And this is basically everything that we don't see usually. That's like part of what makes mushrooms. And like mushrooms are basically the fruits of fungi. They spread the spores of fungi so they can keep creating more of those mycelia, those little white fibers that connect to things like plant roots, because fungi also don't photosynthesize. So they need
Right.
help getting the nutrients that they need to keep growing. And especially since fungi mostly exist underground, it's just when they have a fruit like a mushroom that they can even get anything above the surface of the earth. They need things like oxygen. It's a pretty oxygen deprived environment down there. So they'll plug into roots like redwood roots and start transferring things like, oh, this micellar network has fixated a lot of nitrogen, or it has lots of sugars that it's formed living under the ground, and it can give this redwood those, and in exchange, the redwood gives all that good oxygen and carbon it's taken in and processed from its photosynthetic process. And everybody, most of the time, gets to live pretty happily in what's called a mycorrhizal network, that connection between plants, quite often trees, and micellar networks, so big fungi networks.
That's so interesting. I think the one thing that when I first thought about this, it kind of blew my mind related to this, is that, we think of mushrooms being the mushrooms we see, but you said they're the fruiting body. And the way I like to think about it is that the mushroom is like the apple, and the mycelial network, that's the tree equivalent, right? The mushroom is more the stuff underground than it is the thing we see, which is kind of mind blowing.
Exactly.
Yeah, really, really fascinating.
And a lot of the fungi and plants that really like redwoods are what are called epiphytes. So they'll actually grow out of the redwood too, which is kind of crazy. Because if a fungus is growing out of something, it means that either the micellar network has extended sort of into or even into the grooves of the bark of that tree or of that plant, or spores have managed to spread onto the bark of that plant. And they're growing just like, if you've seen shelf mushrooms, they'll grow just like out of the side of a tree or a log. And that's where they start if the mycelium haven't somehow made their way up the side of the tree, which is pretty cool.
I don't know enough about mushrooms, but you could do a whole podcast like this and just do mushrooms. There's a whole other world, and it's just like
totally
really mind blowing. Yeah, I've only scratched the surface with my mushroom knowledge for sure.
Same, and it's like supposed to be part of my job to look up a bunch of different plant and other living species.
Yeah, it's a lot to learn.
But yeah, that's a little bit about kind of, it's a beginning of the sort of sharing network between redwoods and fungi, and how fungi can also, well, actually, before I move on, I thought of one more thing.
Sure.
So there's this nutrient transfer that can happen between redwoods and fungi, and similarly between redwoods and other plants that they can kind of intersect roots with. And in some cases, they can also communicate information.
Oh.
So they can produce enzymes that let other plants know, or fungi know, if there's especially like a threat in the area, or if there's been like an increase in a certain nutrient or a decrease in a certain nutrient, and other plants will sense that. And sometimes they can prepare and offset that sort of imbalance in nutrients, which is wild.
Yeah, that's really, it's not just the chemical exchange. It is like, it makes you like really think about, what does information mean, right? Like, we're so like trained to think about like a book is what information is, right? But like,
totally
interesting, very cool. What else you have? What other fun facts and dazzling details do we have about the coastal redwood?
All right, so all kinds of fun facts about coastal redwoods. They are very old, in addition to being very tall. So their Latin name is Sequoia sempervirens, which means basically the ever-living sequoia, which makes sense because they evolved into pretty much the species they are now at least 240 million years ago.
Wow.
So they've been around for a long time. And the oldest sort of officially age recorded coast redwood is about 2,200 years old.
Whoa.
But arborists think that, or forestry people in general think that there's probably redwoods that are a lot older than that. Their rings are just so small, or they're so hard to find, or they don't want to cut any part of it off or down to get the recording. But they think that there may be much older, potentially over 3,000-year-old redwoods.
That's incredible.
It is, yeah. It's awesome how long they'll live. And because they're so good at like all the sharing that we talked about, they become basically an entire ecosystem within one tree, which is awesome. And a lot of what my fun facts are based off of, because it's one of my favorite kind of parts about them. It's another one of those layers. Literally, it's kind of like we can go from canopy to roots, or we can go from just thinking they're neat to realizing like the huge role they play in ecology. They've got so much going on. And so, yeah, one of my favorite things that they have going on is they are so large that there will be certain like algae species or bird species or other like sort of reptilian amphibian species that live like in their canopy or in their trunk. There's a couple of endemic species, so species that only live, basically they share a range with the coast redwood because they're dependent on the coast redwood or species like it to have the environment that they need to survive, and they don't really have the structural integrity. They won't survive if they try to venture outside of sort of the zone where the coast redwood also lives. So there's like a salamander called the wandering salamander that is very mobile for a salamander, but it'll mostly move throughout a grove of redwoods throughout its entire life.
Whoa.
So it'll stay off the ground up in the branches of these trees.
Wow, man. That's amazing. I love salamanders, but that's cool, like a tree salamander.
Yep, tree salamander. There's also, what I learned about pretty recently is there's these things called ensatinas, which are a type of lungless salamander. So I don't really know how their oxygen exchange works. I assume they probably still need some oxygen to survive. I don't know if they have like crazy pores in their skin or what. I just know that they don't have lungs.
Wow, that's incredible too. Wow, I'm so many things to Google after this to see the pictures of.
Right. That's what I've been doing for like this last week or so. Is just like, wait, what's that? Wait, what's that? It's pretty cool. And so yeah, there's like these endemic species. There's a bunch of species of manzanita that share a range, or sort of their range matches a section of the coast redwood range, and they specifically grow in the under canopy because they get like just the right amount of sunlight and water from growing under redwoods. There's a bird called the marbled murrelet, which any listeners or anyone who catches one of this podcast episodes somehow will know if they're in the Santa Cruz area. It's a super, luckily not as endangered species anymore, but it was a threatened and then briefly endangered species that conservationists in the Santa Cruz area have worked really, really hard to save, and tend to migrate kind of between the cliffs, I believe, in Santa Cruz and the forests in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So they're very dependent on those trees to survive, and they usually live pretty high up in their canopies.
Very cool. Is that like a birder's bird? If you're a birder, you're like, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's cool.
Definitely. Yeah, sorry, I should have mentioned what they were.
Yeah, no, I just, I know, I'm really not a birder. I like birds, but like I have friends who are like real birders, and yeah, that sounds like one of the ones that would be on their bird list, to see.
Yep.
Very good.
There's like a classic phrase amongst a lot of my friends who are like, we have a very distinct like birders and sort of just like bird appreciators in my friend group. And we're like, yeah, I've been practicing my birding. That sure is a bird.
There goes the mockingbird again. Yeah.
Yep.
Very good. Well, yeah. What else? Let's wrap this up. What's kind of the takeaway of the coastal redwood for you?
It's a good question. The takeaway to me is that they are, in many ways, very sort of specifically Californian or like West Coastian. They have this really, really sort of endemic range, and they're really, really special and helpful to the place where they are. So it's a tree that I set a lot of life goals for me. I hope to someday be as special and helpful as a ghost redwood tree. Yeah, for me as a kid, I thought they were really magical. I definitely took like the phrase, things like the phrase fairy rings to heart. I was convinced that like going into a redwood forest was where you could find like fairies and gnomes and elves and all these like things that the kind of, I feel, childhood imagination just like runs away with. And I feel like even though I may not still expect all those same things now, walking into like a redwood grove or a redwood forest, it still holds that same kind of like magical quality where like there's fog and it's humid but temperate, and you can just see some sun shining through onto these wonderful like under canopy species. And some coast redwoods seem so tall when you look up you almost like can't see the top of them, so it's like you're going into this kind of magical like parallel universe or something.
Not our universe, not our ship, something parallel. Parallel universe, coexisting with ours on another dimensional plane.
Thanks so much for sharing about coast redwood with me. Do you mind if I share a plant with you?
I would love that.
Awesome. Let's stick with big trees here. But I'm going to kind of explain to you how I encountered this tree and how I learned about it, because it was kind of a circuitous path. So I'd like to take you on that if that's okay.
Yeah, sounds good.
Awesome. So I first encountered this plant. I work for this environmental nonprofit called the Environmental Investigation Agency, and a number of years ago I was in Peru doing a video project, and I met this guy in the Amazon, and we started talking about. I'm really interested in like the foods people eat in different places around the world that we would never hear of, right, in where we're from, because there's so many things that are just like completely off like the radar you never find in a supermarket, things like that. And so we're talking. My Spanish isn't great. I had a guy who was translating with me to try to help, but we were talking about it, getting kind of excited, nerding out about food. And he mentioned this thing called. He said he asked me if I knew about castagna, and I was like, castagna, and like I was trying to have the guy who was there to translate better, because I know that word. It's a word in many European languages means chestnut. And I was like, I don't think there's chestnut in the jungle. So what is he talking about? But that was the only word he had for it. And I was like, yeah, I don't know it. And so he's like, wait 1 second. And he left, and he came back with one. And it looked like he was bringing out a coconut. It was like the same size as a coconut, looked exactly like a coconut.
Whoa.
And then he took a machete, and he started chopping it in half. And he cracked it open, but instead of a coconut, which has like water inside and kind of the meat, there was like there's like a handful of these smaller nuts that were about like 2 inches long, and they were like covered in this like this dark, rind. And then he very expertly took these little nuts and also with machete, peeled them. And inside there was this like white, it almost looked like coconut inside. I said, but it wasn't as flaky, but the same color, and also quite oily. And he gave me a taste, and I was like, it tastes great. It was very like rich and really tasty. I still didn't know what they were. I was like, okay. And so he gave me a handful of them, and I went back to like the city that day, and I was in my hotel room, and I had like just a little tiny Swiss Army knife, and I was like trying to get them open, but they were like so hard, and I was like, I'm gonna like slice my finger off. But I eventually like got some open, and I ate a little bit more, but it was mostly like they like had the like when you crack a walnut, but there's still like lots of the nut, like the shell in it, like. But then I was like, what is this thing? What am I eating? It's really good, but why have I never heard of it? So I started Googling. Looks like a coconut, has other nuts inside of it, and then the answer was obvious. Now I was in Peru, but these were Brazil nuts.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I was like, oh, Brazil nuts. Yeah. So yeah, that was the first time I interacted with a Brazil nut that wasn't in a jar of Planters mixed nuts, which is like, yeah, I don't know. It's weird that we have the concept of Brazil nut, but like I never thought to think about where it's from.
Totally.
So then it was a few years later, I was back in Peru, and this time doing a different film project, and we were in a local community in the Amazon. And they took us out into the jungle to show us like all the different forest products that they can harvest there, like this non-timber forest products is what they call them. And they took us to a Brazil nut tree, and we got up to it, and it was way bigger than I expected. Not quite as big as a coast redwood, but they get up to 50 meters tall. They're probably, if not one of, the largest tree in the Amazon. They get taller than anything. Like the big trees in the Amazon kind of top out at 40 meters, and these often get to 50 meters. They're also one of the oldest trees in the Amazon, so not quite as old as the coast redwood, but for the this Amazon, much more like dynamic environment with lots more like changes. They can be up to 1,000 years old, maybe older, which is. And this one they said was This one that we were looking at was 500 years old. And so we're looking up at this tree, and I start to like move closer, and they're like, "No, you have to stay back." And I was like, "What?" And they're like, "It's dangerous." And I was like, "What?" And they're like, "Yeah, if one of those coconut things falls and hits you in the head, it will kill you." They weigh like up to 2 kilograms a piece, and they're falling from 50 meters.
Yeah, that'll do it.
It's serious. So when they harvest the Brazil nuts, this is also super fascinating. Basically, every single Brazil nut you've ever eaten was harvested from the wild, which is super interesting for like a commercial product, because you can't grow Brazil nuts in a plantation. They grow way too slowly, and also which I'll talk about later, they have some very other particular things that means you can't grow them in a plantation. But so you have to collect, and you also have to collect them from the ground after they fall, because the trees, you can't go up, it's too dangerous to like try to like pick them from the tree. So they only have to collect them from the ground. So when they go collect them, they have to wear helmets. So like no one had helmets that day, so we had to stay back really far just to look at the tree. And it was also not quite the season. They weren't really harvesting at the time. But I was like, wow, that's a whole process. And so all over the Amazon, there's different communities that have wild trees that may have been there for 1,000 years, still producing like, I think like thousands of pounds, maybe, well, not thousands, I forget the number. 150 to 200 pounds of nuts annually per tree, which is pretty amazing. And it's a really important like cash crop for like people in the jungle, because it's like this really cool wild harvested food, which I'm always so fascinated about those things.
Yeah, now I'm like, how am I even able to buy these in the store? That seems so impressive, like their journey.
Yeah, and they are very different when you eat them in the store, because they're like roasted and dried. Like often in the jungle, they eat them fresh, and they do have a little bit more of this like, I don't know if you've ever had like a really fresh nut of some sort, but it's even different because they're way oilier. Like, and there's a lot, actually the Brazil nut oil is a thing apparently, as well. Like people will express the oil from it. And we had some really awesome dishes while they were there, made out of like Brazil nuts, like sauces and other things. It's really awesome, and the flavor's much more intense than when you have them. I know, like people kind of think some people think they're the worst nut in the mixed nuts. I don't, but yeah, they're definitely a different experience from the fresh ones. What else do I have here about these really interesting trees? Let's do I love the names of things, scientific names and things like that. This is one that happens a lot. So the scientific name is Bertholletia excelsa, and excelsa means lofty or tall, because they're the tallest in the forest.
Sense.
Bertholletia is one of those ones that's like always a little disappointing, because it's just named after some French guy, named Berthollet. Some other French guy named it after him. It has nothing to do with the tree. But what is interesting about it is you mentioned how there are 2 extant species of redwood are in the Sequoia genus. The genus Bertholletia is a monotypic genus, so it's the only species in the genus, which is pretty cool. And it's the family it's in has also got a lot of other kind of unknown trees, but it's in the same order, Ericales, as a lot of other like things like blueberries and persimmons are in the same order, but that's quite a few levels up. When I mentioned that they don't really, there's no way to really grow them in a plantation, it's because the main reason is because there's several species of large-bodied bees that are required for the pollination. So the fruit is apparently quite complex, and it's got like this door or something that's closed, and like the bees have to be strong enough to lift up this like this like latch or whatever to get in to pollinate, and those bees don't live; they live in the jungle. So there's like, even if you could grow a tree somewhere, or like you cut down all the trees and started to like turn an area into like a more urban area, they wouldn't pollinate, so you wouldn't get more trees. The other really cool thing about how they spread, so the bees pollinate it, they make these giant fruits. The giant fruits fall to the ground, and then the fruits do have this like little hole in them, which, as much as you can say anything in nature is designed, appears to be made just so the agouti, which is a species of large Amazonian rodent, for them to be able to gnaw it open, and the agouti eats some of the nuts, but also it's like the squirrel of the jungle. It's much bigger than a squirrel, but they bury the seeds for later. They forget about some, and that's the way that the Brazil nut actually spreads, is through this specific interaction with a rodent. So the last little thing I guess I want to talk about is kind of the threats to them. So they are listed as vulnerable, and like a lot of the stuff in the Amazon, it's really deforestation is the main threat.
Yeah.
Like there's lots of deforestation for cattle, for other kinds of crops, for just for logging. Actually, the wood is quite prized, and so sometimes people cut them down for the wood, which is like 500-year-old tree that's pretty rough.
Yep.
And so they are vulnerable, and yeah, there's just this kind of risk, right? Like that one, they get cut down too fast. And it's this is so interesting, the comparison between jungle forests and like the temperate forests, right? You don't get 50 Brazil nut trees next to each other in the jungle. I was reading that they're often max 2 per hectare.
Oh, wow.
Is kind of common, right? The jungle is like a bunch of species all spread out, and you rarely get multiple species growing next to each other. And so there's fewer of them, and then you have this spread of deforestation, and then you also have a little bit, but to a lesser degree, over harvest. So they're pretty sustainable because they're just the nuts. But if you take every single one, you don't leave any for the agoutis to go spread. And you need 500 years to get a big one again, right? You need the time. There is some risk there as well. So it's when you look at that jar of mixed nuts, it's like really interesting, the story that Brazil nut kind of opens up of like 1,000-year history and sustainability and the risk and giant killer nuts, and like it's really fascinating.
Yeah, I'm definitely not going to look at like the bag or the jar of mixed nuts from the store the same way ever again. I'll be like, wow, these were in this bigger thing that's also spread by rodents, and I shouldn't eat too many. I don't know.
Yeah, and keep your eye out too for. I'm going to try to put some links in the show notes. There are like different ways to like make sure that you're some fair trade stuff and things like that are related to how they're harvested. But it is pretty cool. They're not like causing monoculture agriculture when you eat that nut, that specific nut. So they have that going for them. But hopefully people can like stop cutting down the Amazon, which is a big fight for everybody.
Yeah, I didn't end up mentioning it about the coast redwood, but yeah, it's basically deforestation for them as well, or logging specifically. Basically, the gold rush and the building of cities, entirely wood buildings at that time, wiped out, I think, 80% out of the 96% that have been deforested. So they're in rough shape, but they've got great organizations looking out for the 4% that are left. So we're doing our best to preserve them and help them spread. But yeah, people can really, really mess up trees' livelihoods.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I was thinking about that the other day too, and it's like, it really is this like colonialist mentality of like extracting things, right? And there was this interesting point in time where someone decided, hey, maybe we shouldn't cut these all down. But there's a lot of complicated history there as well. But yeah, I do, knowing like what species are in demand around the world, that if it was possible to cut them, they would be gone, because they're really, the wood is amazing, right? Yep. And it produces a ton, and yeah, I know there's like houses around that still have like this redwood siding, which is like phenomenal. So it's good we still have them, because yeah, it's hard for at least certain cultures to not see a tree like that and only see it for its timber value. Yeah, well, what a cool conversation. I'm really glad that I got to hear about the coast redwoods from you, and that you talking about a big tree really made me think, oh yeah, there's this really big tree that really had an impact on me. It kind of wasn't in the front of my mind, but so thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, thank you for yours. That was awesome. I learned a lot of new plant facts today.
Excuse the sound of a tram going by right now. I am still in Switzerland, and what a lovely episode speaking with Sophia about coast redwood and Brazil nut. And quite strangely, I think, I happen to be looking right now at a giant sequoia. Now, this is not the coast redwood. This is the other extant species of sequoia that I'm looking at, but it's growing here in the middle of Zurich, Switzerland, which is kind of strange. I was looking online for like what big trees grow in Zurich, because I like to find big trees when I travel around, and I was kind of surprised, and it was like somewhat coincidental that there are there actually used to be two right where I'm looking at. I see a stump here as well where they had to cut one of them down, I think due to disease, but right here in the middle of Zurich there's two giant sequoias, which is pretty interesting. In fact, all around Switzerland there's quite a number of giant sequoias that are growing around here, and I think it's that story of people seeing this amazing tree when they first visited the North American continent and saying, hey, these are really cool, let's plant them back in Europe. In fact, once I was in New Zealand, and there's a whole forest of redwoods in New Zealand, I think for the similar reason, but it seems that one of these trees had some kind of disease and they had to cut it down, and it looks like the other one might be in a little bit rough shape too. It's got a lot of like defoliation up at the top, so hopefully they can figure out how to save it so it doesn't have to be cut down like this other one. I was trying to do a little bit of research about these. I haven't had that much time to learn their history. I was able to tell that they were planted in 1860, so that's pretty young for the 2,000-year-old giant sequoias. But it is still a very big tree. I actually don't know the exact height, but I'm looking at it. It definitely towers above the buildings here. In fact, I was looking for where it was, and I could actually then see it in the distance above the buildings in the distance, so that's interesting. One last other little fact that I read when I was reading an article about the tree that was sick. There was an article in a local paper, and there was a quote from the arborist of the city of Zurich who was saying that, when this was planted, the owners of the villas tried to impress each other by planting sequoias, and now they do it with Porsches. So I thought that was pretty funny, and a good way to end this episode of the show, standing next to a giant sequoia in Zurich, Switzerland. Speak to you on the next one. My guest on this episode of Rootbound was Sophia Mahoney Rural, aka your gentle millennial friend. You can follow Sophia on Instagram at Gentle Millennial Friend, where she hosts a judgment-free zone where you can ask all the questions you might have been afraid to ask. If you like Rootbound and you want to help support the show, visit rootboundpodcast.com/support to find all the ways you can support the show, including following us on Instagram at Rootbound Podcast. Rootbound is hosted by Seeker of Giant Trees, Steve Ellington. Music by Christian Kriegesgota. Fake ads by David Lonnie. Rootbound is a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, but if you can go outside, seek out the parallel universe that is a redwood forest.
Chicory! It's an acquired taste. Acquire it today!